This chapter summarizes the complex set of legal concepts, players, and social issues that have defined the debate over regulation of children's media. A complex group of government and individual entities struggle to maintain the balance between the protection of First Amendment rights and the protection of vulnerable members of the audience. There are 7 entities that have an influence over public policy and regulation as it relates to children's media in particular. These would be the FCC, the federal courts, the White House, Congress, industry, citizens groups, and the Federal Trade Commission, FTC. Okay, as we start looking at media policy, let's start with the 1950s. While there were no regulations specifically targeting children and media, both houses of Congress held hearings to investigate the impact of radio and television on children. The Senate focused more specifically on the relationship between media and juvenile delinquency. Industry representatives repeatedly invoked the First Amendment as a protection against governmental interference in television content. And as a result, the National Association of Broadcasters promised to self-regulate, and they developed the Television Code, which provided guidelines of what and how content could be shared on TV. In the 1960s, the FCC identified children's programs as one of 14 program types that were necessary for public broadcasters to fulfill their obligation to meet the public interest. This was the first time that the FCC had identified children as a special audience that deserved attention. Stations had to provide evidence that they were serving the special audience to facilitate their license renewal. In the meantime, Congress was also paying attention to children and television in the 60s. 5 Senate hearings were held in that decade with a focus on television violence and children's behaviors. The Surgeon General was asked to oversee a multi-year $1 million project to investigate these findings. The results from this study were the subject of their own congressional hearings in the early 1970s. The decade of the 1970s can be encapsulated as the public advocacy decade. While concerned citizens groups were finding new ways to advocate for better children's programming, the industry seemed content to provide more of the same. Formed in 1968 and headed by Peggy Charon, Action for Children's Television, ACT, was among the most vocal of citizens groups calling for governmental action. The ACT even went as far as to petition the Federal Trade Commission to ban all commercials during children's programs. However, in an unprecedented show of lobbying power, the television and advertising industries derailed the proposal by getting Congress to pass a law that specifically prohibited the agency from adopting such practices. The 1980s are known as the Deregulation Decade in general, and that certainly is true in the area of children's television regulation. The marketplace was supposed to separate quality programs from junk, and it was supposed to punish advertisers who unfairly targeted children with deceptive messages. At least that was the opinion of the FCC under its new chairman, Mark Fowler. And finally, in the 1990s, this would be categorized as the decade of reckoning. The FCC changed leadership, and Congress changed its stance from simply talking about regulating television to actually passing laws that did. 2 major regulations in the 1990s, the Children's Television Act of 1990 and the Telecommunications Act of 1996, were revolutionary. Let's start by looking at the Children's Television Act of 1990.